It was just another quiet evening at the small diner on the corner of Maple Street. The kind of place that felt like home the moment you stepped inside. A warm glow from the old-fashioned lights hanging from the ceiling bathed the room in a soft, welcoming light. The clink of silverware against plates, the hum of low conversations, and the sizzling sounds coming from the kitchen were all part of the usual rhythm that made the diner feel alive. In one of the booths near the window, a couple sat, hunched over their menus discussing the special of the day. A group of friends were laughing loudly, joking about the latest TV show they had watched. And at the counter, a man in a worn-out leather jacket sipped on his coffee while reading the newspaper, his eyes scanning the headlines. Behind the counter and moving through the small, crowded space was the waitress. She wore a light blue uniform, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, and her face, usually so expressive, seemed a little more tired today. She moved with the kind of purpose that came from years of working here, sliding plates onto tables, refilling mugs of coffee, and exchanging quick pleasantries with the regulars. She had been working at this diner for years, and over time it had become more than just a job. It was a place where people came to unwind, where memories were made, and where the hours slipped by unnoticed. She knew the regulars by name, knew their usual orders and even their moods. Yet, despite all of this, she often felt like she was invisible. She wasn't sure if it was because of her job or because of something about her, but it was the kind of feeling that weighed on her every day. People knew her face, but not much else. She was just the waitress, always in the background, always moving, but never really seen. There were days when she wished she could be more than that. She had dreams, but they always seemed just out of reach. Music, for example. She had loved playing the piano since she was young. The soft keys under her fingers, the melody filling the air, the way the music could make everything else fade away. But no one at the diner knew that side of her. To them, she was just the girl who brought them their food and filled their cups. Her music was just a forgotten memory, a quiet dream tucked away. Today, as she moved around the diner, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. She couldn't explain it, but it was like the air felt thicker, heavier. Maybe it was because of the way the light caught the edges of the worn wooden tables. Or maybe it was the laughter of the group at the far corner of the room. They had been there for a while, and their jokes seemed louder with every passing minute. One of the men, always quick to make a joke, had just made a remark about her. It wasn't the first time. She had heard him laugh about her piano lessons once, making some comment about how she looked like she'd rather be playing music than serving coffee. She had laughed it off back then, but now it stung a little. Was he right? Did she really seem like the kind of person who had bigger dreams, or was she just fooling herself? The thought hung in her mind as she refilled their coffee cups, trying to ignore the sharp sting in her chest. She kept her smile in place as the man gave her a teasing look, like he was trying to get a rise out of her. It wasn't malicious, but it always made her feel small, like her dreams didn't matter, like she was just there to serve and nothing more. The table laughed again, a loud, boisterous sound that seemed to echo in the room. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her as she walked away, and it made her stomach twist. She hated that feeling. The feeling of being looked at but not really seen. The feeling of being the punchline of their jokes, never the center of attention. The clock on the wall ticked away the minutes, and the diner continued to buzz with the usual sounds of dinner hour. People came and went, and the plates piled up with orders, but her mind kept drifting back to the piano that sat in the corner of the room, mostly forgotten, collecting dust. It was a beautiful piano, old and worn, but it had character. It had been there as long as she could remember, pushed against the back wall of the diner. It wasn't something that people paid much attention to anymore. It wasn't like anyone ever played it. But she remembered the first time she had heard it. When she was just a kid, the owner of the diner had brought it in, thinking it would be a fun addition. It had sat there, barely touched, for years. Sometimes when the diner was empty and the sounds of the world outside were muted by the thick glass windows, she would sit at the piano during her break. She would play quietly, just enough for herself to hear. The music was her escape. It was the one place she could feel free, where she wasn't just the waitress, where she was someone else, but even that wasn't something she could share with the world. People didn't want to hear her play. They didn't care. And she knew it. No one had ever asked her to play, not once. In fact, the few times she had started to, someone had joked about how fancy she was acting. That was the last thing she wanted. To be labeled as a show-off or someone who thought she was better than everyone else. So she kept her music to herself, playing only when no one was around, in the silence of the diner when it felt like the world was too loud. Tonight, though, something felt different. Maybe it was the weight of those teasing jokes. Maybe it was the quiet pull in her chest that told her she couldn't hide anymore. She had always thought about playing, always thought about stepping up to that piano and showing the world what she could do. But tonight, for some reason, the thought seemed more real than ever. She glanced at the piano again, the familiar temptation tugging at her. It wasn't just a piano. It was a piece of her heart sitting there in the corner waiting to be heard. She felt a strange sense of urgency, like something was pushing her forward. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she could keep walking past it. Not tonight. Not after everything. As she wiped down the counter, her hand brushed against the edge of the piano, sending a shiver through her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, the sounds of the diner fading away, replaced by the quiet pulse of her heartbeat. It was a moment of stillness, of reflection. But in that stillness, something shifted. She didn't know what exactly it was, but she could feel it. This pull, this growing need to show the world something more. For years, she had tucked her dreams away, out of sight and out of mind. But tonight, something inside her told her that it was time. Time to stop hiding. Time to take a chance. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for anymore. The evening dragged on, and the hum of the diner grew louder as more customers trickled in. The regulars filled the booths, and the soft chatter of the night began to buzz in her ears. She couldn't focus on the orders anymore. Her mind kept drifting back to the piano, tucked away in the corner like it had always been. The sounds of the diner seemed distant, almost muted, as she found herself caught between her responsibilities and the desire to do something she had only ever dreamed of. She could still hear the laughter from the group at the far end of the room. They had been talking about some comedy show they had watched earlier, and the jokes kept coming, louder and more boisterous with every passing minute. It was the kind of laughter that filled the room, so contagious that even those who weren't part of the conversation couldn't help but smile. She hated the way it made her feel. The kind of laughter that was meant to be fun, but always seemed to have a little edge to it when it was directed at her. It was the same feeling she'd had earlier, when the man had joked about her playing the piano. It was light-hearted enough, but it stung just the same. And the thing that made it worse was that she couldn't even bring herself to say anything. She just smiled and walked away, letting the moment slide off her like water off a duck's back. But deep down, she could feel the frustration building. Why did she always have to hide behind the counter, behind the coffee pot and the order pads? Why couldn't she just be herself? It wasn't that she didn't enjoy being a waitress. She liked the customers, she liked the rhythm of the job. It was familiar. It was comfortable. But she also knew that comfort came with a price. It came with the feeling of being invisible, like she was always on the outskirts of everything, never truly part of the world around her. And the piano sitting there gathering dust was a reminder of everything she wasn't showing the world. It was as if it was waiting for her to make a move, to let go of her fear and just play. The idea of sitting at that piano, of letting the music flow, was both exciting and terrifying. It had always been just a thought in the back of her mind, something she told herself she would do someday. But today, someday, felt like it might be right now. The urge to go to the piano, to make something of herself outside of this small, familiar role she had played for so long, had never felt so strong. But the fear was always there. What if they didn't like it? What if they laughed? What if they thought she was trying too hard? The thoughts swirled in her mind like a storm, pushing her toward the piano and then pulling her back. She could almost hear the mocking laughter from earlier echoing in her ears, drowning out the music that wanted to escape. As she wiped down the counter, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the glass. The tired eyes staring back at her were a reminder of the years spent in this place, serving others, always in the background, never asking for attention. But tonight something was different. Tonight she felt like she had a choice. Tonight she didn't have to hide. She could hear the sounds of the group's laughter growing louder, and a part of her wanted to drown it out, to escape the noise. She wanted to escape this role that had been given to her, this role she had accepted without question for so long, the waitress. The invisible one, the one who was always serving but never seen. The thought of being more than that was like a breath of fresh air in a room that had always felt stuffy. She glanced at the piano again. It seemed to call out to her silently, but so strongly that it almost felt like it was speaking to her. It was just there as it always had been. But now, instead of being a symbol of something she couldn't have, it felt like an invitation. An invitation to show the world, to show herself who she truly was. Maybe no one would notice. Maybe no one would care. But at least for once, she would be doing something that was just for her, something that was hers alone. But still, the fear lingered. What if she was making a mistake? What if they laughed at her? What if they thought she was ridiculous, pretending to be something she wasn't? The laughter from earlier played in her mind again, and she felt her shoulders tense. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in her head. Maybe if she just ignored it for a little while, the feeling would pass. She finished wiping down the counter, glancing at the clock. It was getting late, and the diner was starting to thin out. The group of friends at the far booth was still talking, but their voices were quieter now. Some of the regulars were finishing up their meals, preparing to leave. The pace of the diner had slowed. The moment she had been waiting for was almost here. For a moment, she considered walking away. Just forget about it. Let the piano stay where it was, collecting dust like it always had. But as she looked around the room, she realized something. This was her moment. This was her chance. If she didn't take it, she might never get another one. The thought of doing something for herself, of stepping out of the shadows for once, made her heart race. She didn't know if it would work, but she was done waiting for the perfect moment. There would never be a perfect moment. She had to make it happen now, or she'd keep living in the same loop, stuck in the same role. Before she could second-guess herself, she found herself walking toward the corner of the room where the piano sat. The movement felt strange, like her legs were moving on their own, like the decision had already been made for her. As she got closer, she hesitated just for a second. Her hand hovered over the edge of the piano, and she closed her eyes, feeling the cool wood beneath her fingers. The piano sat in the same spot it always had, but it suddenly seemed larger, more alive, as if it had been waiting for her all along. A small, nervous smile tugged at her lips. The room was quieter now. Only a few customers remained, sipping coffee or finishing their meals. The man in the leather jacket was still there, his back to her, reading the newspaper. The group of friends had stopped talking, lost in their own thoughts. This was it. No turning back. With one last deep breath, she sat down at the piano. The bench creaked under her weight, and her fingers hovered over the keys. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention on her, even though no one was looking directly at her. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't let it stop her. She had made the decision. Now there was no going back. She pressed down on the first key, and the sound filled the air, soft and gentle. It was only one note, but it was enough to break the silence. She glanced up briefly, but no one was paying attention. They were all caught up in their own worlds, lost in their own thoughts. She played a few more notes, and as the sound grew, she felt her fear begin to melt away. There was no applause, no laughter, just the sound of the piano, filling the empty spaces of the diner. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged. As the first few notes of the song drifted through the air, something in the diner shifted. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. People kept talking, moving about, and the clink of silverware against plates filled the background. But there was a change. It was subtle, like the air itself had gotten a little thicker, a little heavier. The sound of the piano, though soft, had begun to seep into the cracks of the room, taking over the space in a way that felt almost magical. The woman's fingers moved across the keys, unsure at first, like she was testing the waters. She played a simple, familiar melody, a piece she had practiced countless times, one that had comforted her for years. The notes were gentle, hesitant at first, but they flowed with an elegance that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. The laughter from the group at the far end of the diner faded away as the music took over. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, as the melody filled the air, the noise quieted. It wasn't that the customers consciously decided to stop talking. It was as though the music demanded their attention. One by one, they turned their heads toward the piano. Some of them squinted, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. Others paused mid-sentence, their voices trailing off as they focused on the music. For the woman at the piano, it felt like she was floating in a different world. Her hands moved with a certainty that surprised her, as if the music itself had taken control. The sounds she had once only played in the quiet solitude of her own thoughts now filled the diner. Her heart beat in rhythm with the melody, and for a brief moment she felt like she wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was someone else, someone real. The man in the leather jacket at the counter glanced up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The group at the booth stopped their conversation entirely, exchanging confused glances. They weren't sure what to make of the situation. This wasn't what they had expected when they walked into the diner. The woman at the piano was just the waitress, the one who brought them coffee and pie, not someone who could play like this. But now, as they listened, they couldn't help but feel drawn to the soft, steady rhythm of the song. There was an unfamiliarity in the air, as though the room had been momentarily transported to a different time. The diner, which had always felt like a place of comfort, now felt like something more, a sanctuary where the ordinary had transformed into something extraordinary. The laughter that had once filled the space with a sense of lightness now felt out of place. The music, in all its softness and power, demanded respect. The waitress felt her nerves begin to settle, the initial anxiety of playing in front of others fading as she became more lost in the music. Her hands moving effortlessly across the keys no longer felt like they belonged to someone afraid of judgment. They were just hands playing the music they had always known, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt connected to something bigger than herself. It wasn't the piano or the music or even the diner. It was the sense of freedom that washed over her, a freedom she hadn't realized she was searching for until now. But as she played, she couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere. The once loud and boisterous crowd was now quiet. Some of the regulars who had barely glanced at her earlier were now fully engaged. A few had even moved closer as though they wanted to hear every note, every pause. The music had become a bridge between them and her, something that connected her to their world. Even if just for a brief moment, at the far end of the diner, the man who had laughed earlier, the one who had joked about her playing the piano, was staring at her now. His expression had changed. The smirk that had been on his face earlier was gone, replaced by something more serious. He wasn't laughing anymore. Instead, he seemed mesmerized, caught in the gentle rise and fall of the music. It wasn't just the piano that had caught his attention. It was the woman who was playing it, the woman he had only ever seen as a waitress. She had always been there, always in the background, and he had never thought twice about her. But now, as the music filled the space, he realized there was so much more to her than the apron and the coffee pot. She was a person with a gift, a talent he had never known about. And for the first time, he saw her for who she really was, not just the waitress, but an individual with something beautiful to offer. For a moment, it felt as though the entire diner had become one single entity, all of them focused on the woman at the piano. The diner, once a place of casual conversation and shared meals, had become a space of quiet reverence, as though the music had brought them all together in a way nothing else could. It wasn't just about the song anymore. It was about the connection, the moment they were all sharing. As she continued to play, her eyes occasionally flitted up, catching the eyes of the customers. Some of them were smiling. Some were leaning forward in their seats, clearly caught up in the music. The woman felt a flutter of hope rise in her chest. She hadn't expected this. She had expected mockery or maybe silence, but she hadn't expected this feeling of unity, of understanding. The music had done something she had never thought possible. It had allowed her to step out of the shadows and into the light. The laughter, which had once been so loud and overwhelming, was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, appreciative silence. Even the man in the leather jacket, who had been so absorbed in his newspaper just moments before, was now watching her intently. His arms were crossed, his body leaning slightly forward, as though he couldn't bear to miss a single note. The group at the booth, who had been so quick to dismiss her earlier, were now listening with rapt attention. They were no longer just a bunch of people laughing at the latest joke. They were people experiencing something real, something unexpected, and for the first time in a long time, they seemed to realize it. The waitress's hands moved faster now, as though the music itself was urging her to keep going. The song began to swell, growing more confident with every passing note. She was no longer playing for herself. She was playing for them, for all of them. She wasn't sure how or why, but the music had become a conversation, a way of connecting with the people in the room without words. And just when she thought the song had reached its peak, she hit a wrong note. It wasn't a huge mistake, just a slight misstep, but it was enough to jar her out of her focus. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she wondered if the silence would turn into laughter. But to her surprise, the room remained still. There was no chuckle, no raised eyebrows. It was as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for her to continue, and continue she did. With a small, nervous smile, she adjusted her fingers and picked up right where she had left off, letting the music flow once more. The moment of imperfection, instead of breaking the connection, only made it stronger. They weren't here to judge her. They were here to listen, to experience something real and raw, and for that she was grateful. As the last note of the song lingered in the air, she sat back, her hands still resting on the keys. The room was silent for a few moments, the air thick with anticipation. She had done it. She had played her heart out, and no one had laughed. No one had mocked her. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if everyone was processing what they had just heard, trying to grasp the magic that had filled the room. Finally, the silence was broken by a single clap. It was slow at first, unsure, but then it grew, and soon the entire diner was clapping, the sound echoing through the room. She hadn't expected it, hadn't expected any response at all. But the applause was warm, genuine, and it made her chest tighten with emotion. She stood up from the piano, her hands still trembling slightly, and offered a small, grateful smile to the room. The applause continued for a few more moments, and then, just like that, it was over. The room returned to its usual rhythm, the clink of silverware, the murmur of voices, and the quiet shuffle of feet. But something had changed. The diner and the people in it would never be quite the same. The applause slowly faded, but the quiet feeling it left behind lingered. The woman stood by the piano, her hands still resting lightly on the keys, feeling the weight of the moment. For a few seconds, everything felt suspended, like time itself had paused. She glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the customers who had once been strangers but who now seemed to have shared something with her. She had given them a part of herself, something raw and real, and they had accepted it without question. The man in the leather jacket was the first to speak. His voice broke through the quiet air, and he was smiling, but there was something different about his expression. He wasn't mocking anymore. Instead, there was a hint of respect in his eyes. "That was something else," he said, his tone genuine. "I didn't know you could play like that." She could only manage a small smile in return. The compliment was more than she had expected. She wasn't used to being seen like this, not as the waitress, not as the invisible one who merely served coffee and wiped down tables. But now, for a brief moment, she was someone more than that. She was someone who could make people stop, listen, and feel. "Thanks," she muttered, still unsure of how to handle the attention. Her heart was racing, but not with the nerves she had felt earlier. Now it was something else, a strange mix of excitement and disbelief. It wasn't that she hadn't dreamed of moments like this before. She had always wondered what it would be like to do something meaningful, to be seen for more than the tasks she performed day after day. But actually experiencing it, living it in real time, was different. It was overwhelming. The group at the booth was quiet now, and as she made her way back toward the counter, she caught a glimpse of their faces. They weren't laughing anymore. In fact, they looked almost thoughtful. One of them, a young woman with short dark hair, was staring at the piano with a look of awe, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. The others were nodding, smiling to themselves, the kind of smile that suggested they were still processing what had happened. She felt a sudden wave of gratitude toward them. In a way, it was their energy, their initial judgment and laughter that had pushed her to do it. If they hadn't laughed, if they hadn't made her feel like an outsider, she might not have had the courage to prove them wrong. It was strange how things worked out like that. What had started as a moment of self-doubt had turned into something far greater than she had expected. As she passed by the counter, the man in the leather jacket gave her a casual nod. "You should do that more often," he said, his voice softer now, as though he were offering advice rather than just making a comment. "You've got something, you know." Her heart skipped again. She hadn't expected to hear that. The woman smiled awkwardly. "I don't know about that," she said, trying to downplay it. "Just a little something for fun." But it wasn't just for fun, she knew that now. This was a part of her. It always had been, buried beneath the surface of the day-to-day routine. It had been so easy to ignore it, to push it aside in favor of the comfort of predictability, of being the person everyone expected her to be. But today something had shifted. Something inside her had cracked open, and for the first time in a long while she felt like she could be more than just the waitress. For the rest of the night, the diner seemed quieter. Not in a bad way, but in a peaceful way. The energy had changed. People weren't rushing in and out, moving with their usual haste. They lingered over their meals, talking less, reflecting more. Even the waitstaff, who normally moved through the room with a practiced sense of urgency, slowed their pace. It was as though the music had created a moment of stillness, and no one wanted to break it. She took a deep breath and wiped down the counter again, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. She could still hear the echo of the song in her mind, the way the keys had felt beneath her fingers, the way the notes had vibrated through the air. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it had felt right, and that was enough. But the evening didn't end there. When the last few customers stood to leave, the woman noticed something unusual. The man in the leather jacket, who had seemed so detached before, now walked up to her. He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, unsure. She had never thought of him as someone who would be interested in something like this, let alone approach her at all. "Hey," he said, his voice casual but kind. That was really something. "You shouldn't hide that talent. People need to see it." She blinked, taken off guard by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks," she said again, this time with more confidence. "I don't know if I'm any good, but it felt good to play." "I think you're more than good," he said with a chuckle. But there was no humor in his words now. "You've got something. Don't keep it to yourself." She felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. She had always seen him as just another customer, another face in the crowd. But now he seemed like someone who had seen her, truly seen her in a way no one else had. Before she could say anything more, the man turned to leave, but not without giving her one last smile. It was warm, and there was something in it that made her feel seen. The door swung open and the sound of the bell rang out, signaling the end of the night. She stood there for a moment, frozen in place, as the realization of what had just happened slowly sunk in. People had noticed. They hadn't laughed. They hadn't dismissed her. They had listened. And even though it wasn't a grand performance, it was a moment of connection, a moment that meant something. With the last customer gone, she sat back down at the piano. Her fingers hovered over the keys again, and for a moment she just let them rest there, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. The soft hum of the diner's air conditioning filled the silence, but for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the emptiness. The room no longer felt like a cage, a place she had been trapped in for years. It felt like a canvas, a place where she could create. She pressed a key, just one note and then another, letting the sound ring out. The melody wasn't anything in particular, just a series of notes that felt right. Slowly, almost instinctively, she began to play again. This time it wasn't for anyone else. It wasn't to prove anything. It was just for her. She let the music fill the air again, and as she played, she felt lighter. She felt freer. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was the woman who had played the piano, who had been seen, who had been heard. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The next day, the diner was bustling with its usual rhythm. It was early, just past breakfast time, and the first wave of regulars had already come in. The familiar clink of coffee cups, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, and the chatter of people catching up on their morning news filled the air. But even in the busy hum of the diner, there was something different, something quieter, almost like the room was holding its breath. The woman who had played the piano the night before was moving through the motions as she always did. She filled coffee cups, wiped down tables, and took orders, but there was a change in her. It wasn't something anyone could see. It wasn't something that would be obvious at first glance, but she felt it. She felt lighter, more at ease in her own skin. It was like something inside her had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't mind being in the background. In fact, she didn't feel invisible anymore. When she passed by the counter, the man in the leather jacket was there again. He wasn't the only one from last night's crowd, but somehow he stood out. His presence was quieter today, more subdued. His eyes met hers as she placed a cup of coffee in front of him, and he gave her a small, knowing smile. She could feel his eyes linger for just a second longer than usual, but there was no judgment, no lingering expectation. It was just a smile, and it felt like a reassurance. As she moved to the back to grab an order, she felt a strange mix of emotions. She had never liked the attention, never wanted to stand out. But something had changed. It wasn't that she craved attention now, but she understood that she didn't have to hide anymore. The music from last night had shown her something. It had given her a glimpse of a version of herself she had pushed aside for years. A version that could stand tall, that could do something important, even if just for a moment. As the morning carried on, more customers came and went. But something in the air had shifted. It wasn't that the people were different, but they were looking at her differently. The way they asked for coffee seemed softer, more polite. The usual chuckles and casual comments now had a warmth to them. They weren't just saying things to pass the time, they were seeing her, really seeing her. And it wasn't uncomfortable, it was comforting. She moved through the room, refilling drinks, chatting with the regulars, and taking orders. But with each interaction, there was an unspoken understanding. A respect. Even the way people spoke to her had changed. It was subtle, but it was there. As the morning began to wind down, the last of the breakfast crowd filtered out. She was wiping down a table near the window when the door opened, and in walked a familiar face, one she hadn't seen in a while. The woman who had been at the booth the night before, the one with the short dark hair, came in and looked around before her eyes found the piano. Without a word, she walked over and took a seat near it, her eyes never leaving the keys. The woman at the counter noticed, but she didn't feel the need to rush over. She had learned over the years that sometimes it was okay to just wait. People had their own reasons for doing things. For a moment she stood at the counter, wiping down the last cup, unsure of what was happening in the other room. But then the sound came. It wasn't loud at first, but the first note she heard, soft, tentative, brought her to the edge of the counter. She stepped toward the piano, her heart starting to beat a little faster. The woman from the booth was playing. Not anything fancy, just a simple melody, one that seemed to fill the space with the same warmth that had settled over her the night before. It was different, though. The melody was soft and unsure, like someone trying to find their way. But there was something about it that felt familiar, something that made the woman pause. She wasn't sure why, but the sight of the woman playing the piano felt like a moment of connection. It wasn't just about the music, it was about what it meant. It was about someone who, like her, had found the courage to step out of the shadows and be seen. She could feel it in the way the woman's fingers moved, hesitant at first, but slowly gaining confidence. The woman watched for a few more moments, the soft music filling the space around her. Then, without thinking, she walked over to the piano. The woman from the booth looked up, startled, but when their eyes met, there was no awkwardness. There was understanding. The woman at the piano smiled, a little shy but genuine, as though she hadn't expected to be interrupted, but somehow was glad she was. "That sounded beautiful," the woman at the counter said, her voice soft but steady. The woman at the piano blushed, her hands pausing on the keys for just a second. I don't know. It's nothing special." But the woman at the counter shook her head. "It's more than that. It's important." She stepped back slightly, allowing the space between them to grow just a little. "It's something that matters." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The sound of the piano hung in the air, and for the first time, the woman at the counter felt something stir inside her. It was something she hadn't realized she was missing, a sense of connection to someone else. It wasn't the kind of connection that came from serving coffee or making small talk. It was deeper, more personal. "You know," the woman at the piano said, breaking the silence, "I used to think it didn't matter. Playing, I mean. I thought it was just something I did because I liked it, but after last night, I don't know. It feels different now, like it matters." The woman nodded, her eyes softening as she listened. "It does matter," she said simply. "Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." The two women shared a look, and in that look, something shifted. It wasn't a grand moment, nothing dramatic, but it was real. A quiet understanding passed between them. a shared experience. And in that brief, unspoken exchange, the woman at the piano smiled. It wasn't an anxious smile, the kind that came with self-doubt. It was a smile of recognition, a smile that said, "I am enough." As the day continued, the diner started to empty. The last few customers trickled out, leaving the woman at the counter alone for a few moments. She leaned against the counter, letting the quiet of the space wash over her. Her hands rested on the edge, her mind drifting back to the events of the night before. It felt like a dream, but it was a dream she didn't want to forget. The door opened again, and in walked the man in the leather jacket. This time, he didn't approach her right away. He took a seat at the counter, glancing over the menu, but there was something different about the way he sat, more relaxed, more comfortable. She walked over to him, filling his coffee cup without a word, but when she stepped back, she caught his eye. He smiled, a little less guarded than before, and for a moment she saw something in him that she hadn't noticed the night before. Genuine curiosity. "I didn't expect to see you again today," she said softly. He shrugged, his smile widening. "I didn't expect to be back so soon either, but there's something about this place." He paused, looking around. Something about the music, and the people here. She raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Is that so?" He nodded. "Yeah, it's different, you know? Not just the piano, it's everything." She glanced over at the piano, her smile softening. "Yeah, it's different." He gave her a quick glance, his voice lowering. "I'm glad I heard it. I'm glad you played." She nodded in return, feeling the quiet understanding pass between them again. She hadn't expected anything from him, but now, in this small moment, she realized something. It wasn't just about the music. It was about the way it had connected them all. It had pulled them out of their corners and into a shared space, a space where they could all be a little more real. As the last customer left and the diner started to empty for the night, the woman looked around one more time. The chairs were pushed in, the tables wiped clean. It was the end of another day, but she knew something had changed. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was more than that. And somehow she felt like she always had been.